Brittany Vane snatched the diamond ring right off the display case, slid it onto her finger in front of every guest in that ballroom, and laughed loud enough for Catherine to hear every syllable. Then she turned, found Catherine's eyes across the crowd, and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take good care of everything you lost." The room went deadly silent, and Catherine Monroe, the woman they all assumed was finished, did not look away, not even for a second. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The invitation had arrived at Catherine Monroe's apartment 3 weeks before the gala slipped under her door in a cream-colored envelope with the Sterling family crest embossed in gold on the back. No personal note, no handwritten message, just a formal printed card that read, "Annual Sterling Charity, Gala, Greenwich Estate, black tie required." She had stared at it for a long time, standing in her kitchen in bare feet, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, had called 20 minutes later. "You don't have to go," Priya said immediately. "I already checked. You're not legally obligated to attend any Sterling family event. The divorce settlement doesn't require—" "I know," Catherine said quietly. "Then why are you even considering it?" Catherine set the envelope down on the counter, because not showing up is exactly what they're expecting. There was a pause on the line, then Priya said very carefully, "Catherine, Harrison will be there with her." "I know that too." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Priya finally said. "Then I'll press your black dress." The Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut was the kind of property that didn't just have a driveway, it had an approach. A full quarter-mile of perfectly manicured hedgerow leading up to a house that looked like it had been borrowed from a European dynasty and quietly installed in New England. Catherine had stood in the architect's office 15 years ago when they were designing the East Wing. She had chosen the stonework. She had approved the library's floor-to-ceiling windows. She had picked every rose in the garden from a catalog, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, while Harrison complained that she was taking too long. That was a different lifetime. She arrived alone in a black car, stepping out without fanfare into the cool October air. A valet took her keys without looking at her face. Two women near the entrance glanced over, whispered to each other, and quickly turned away. Catherine straightened her shoulders and walked inside. The ballroom was already full. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across 300 guests, financiers, politicians, socialites, the kind of people whose names appeared in Forbes and whose phone calls got returned within the hour. A string quartet played in the corner. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Catherine accepted a glass, took one small sip, and began to move quietly through the room. She had done this for 22 years, moved through powerful rooms without drawing attention to herself. She had learned early in her marriage that Harrison Sterling liked to be the most visible person in any space he occupied, and that her own visibility made him uncomfortable. So she had become very good at being present without being noticed. She had told herself back then that it was a kind of survival skill. Later she would understand it had been something else entirely. She was near the far window exchanging brief pleasantries with a senator's wife she'd known for years when she felt the shift in the room. It was the kind of shift you could not see, but could absolutely feel a change in the air pressure, a collective inhale, the subtle turning of heads that moved through a crowd like a wave. Catherine did not turn around immediately. She let the senator's wife finish her sentence about a charity auction in the Hamptons. She nodded. She smiled. And then when enough time had passed that turning around would look natural and unhurried, she turned. Harrison Sterling had arrived. He was 54 years old and wore his money the way some men wore cologne aggressively in every direction. He had the silver-templed, square-jawed look of a man who had paid excellent doctors to look distinguished rather than old. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored. His smile was the kind of smile that moved across his face without ever quite reaching his eyes. And beside him, tucked under his arm like a trophy he had just won at auction, was Brittany Vane. Catherine had seen photographs, of course. Everyone had. Brittany had been posting about their relationship on social media for months, carefully curated images designed to look spontaneous. She was 29 years old, with long hair that had never seen a bad photo angle, and the particular kind of confidence that came from being told repeatedly and loudly that you were the most important person in every room you entered. Tonight she was wearing a gown that cost more than some people's cars, and on her left hand, glittering under the chandelier light, with a cold, aggressive brilliance, was a diamond ring that Catherine recognized immediately. Not because it was the most expensive piece in the sterling collection, but because it was the ring that had belonged to Harrison's grandmother, a piece that had been in the Sterling family for 80 years. A piece that had sat in the family vault under a trust document that Harrison did not have the legal authority to simply hand over to anyone. Catherine looked at the ring. Then she looked at Brittany's face. Brittany was already looking at her, and she smiled a slow, deliberate, satisfied smile and raised her champagne glass in a small, mocking toast. The senator's wife touched Catherine's arm gently. "Are you all right, dear?" "Perfectly fine," Catherine said, and her voice was completely steady. Harrison moved through the crowd the way he always had, like the room was a stage and everyone else was the audience. Guests parted for him automatically. Men shook his hand with both of theirs. Women leaned in for air kisses. He accepted it all with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved it. And then he found Catherine. He didn't seek her out. She was simply there in his path, and he chose to stop. "Catherine," he said pleasantly, the way you might say hello to a dental receptionist. "Harrison," she replied. He glanced around, checking she realized whether anyone was watching this interaction. Of course they were. Half the room was watching, pretending not to. "Glad you came," he said, which was clearly not true. "I was invited," she said simply. Brittany pressed closer to Harrison's side and looked at Catherine with the frank, assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. "So this is the famous Catherine," she said, her voice carrying just slightly too far. "Harrison talks about you." "Does he?" Catherine said, not a question. "He says you used to be very—" Brittany tilted her head as if searching for the right word, "involved in everything." She smiled again. "Isn't it funny how things change?" Catherine looked at her for a moment. Just looked. "The way you look at something unexpected. Not angry, not frightened, just genuinely curious about what it is." "Enjoy your evening," Catherine said, and moved away. She heard Brittany laugh softly behind her, and then she heard Harrison say, loud enough to carry, "That's the thing about the past. It never quite knows when it's over." Several people nearby pretended not to have heard, but their faces told a different story. The next hour was the kind of slow, grinding social torture that wealthy people inflict on each other and call an event. Catherine held her champagne. She spoke to people who were visibly uncertain about whether to be seen talking to her. She watched Harrison and Brittany work the room together, a polished, practiced performance, the two of them orbiting each other with the choreographed ease of people who had rehearsed this night. What she had not expected was how organized it would feel. Because that was the thing she began to realize. This was not just Harrison bringing his girlfriend to a party. This was a statement, a calculated, deliberate public declaration. Every move Harrison made tonight had been thought through. Where he stood, who he spoke to first, the timing of his entrance, and at the center of it all was the ring. Because everyone in this room knew that ring, and everyone in this room knew what it meant for Harrison to put it on Brittany's finger. He was saying, "This is finished. The old era is finished. She is finished." He was saying it in the language of the ultra-wealthy, which is not words, it is objects and proximity, and who stands next to whom in a room full of people who understand exactly what they're seeing. Catherine found herself standing near the bar alone for a moment, genuinely calculating her options. She could leave. That would be the graceful thing. Exit early, preserve her dignity. Let Harrison have his moment. She could confront him. But that was what he wanted, a scene, an explosion, something he could describe afterward to make her look unstable and him look composed. Or she could stay, quietly, and wait. She chose the third option because it was the only one that cost her nothing. She ordered a sparkling water and stood at the edge of the room, and she watched. It was at that moment that she felt someone standing beside her, not approaching, simply arriving as if they had always been there. Margaret Sterling was 71 years old and had the particular presence of women who had spent decades in rooms full of powerful men and had long ago stopped being impressed by any of them. She was small in physical stature, barely 5'3", but she occupied space in a way that had nothing to do with height. Her white hair was swept up elegantly. Her dress was dark burgundy. Her jewelry was restrained and genuine. She was Harrison's mother, and she was standing next to Catherine looking out at the room with an expression that was completely unreadable. "He practiced that entrance," Margaret said quietly. "I could tell. He always holds his chin slightly higher when he's rehearsed something." Catherine looked at her. "Margaret." "Don't look at me like that," the older woman said calmly. "Like you're trying to decide whether I'm friend or enemy. I've told you before I don't operate in those categories." "What category do you operate in?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Truth. I operate in truth." She took a slow sip of her wine. "That ring she's wearing." "I know," Catherine said. "He had no legal right to remove it from the trust vault." "I know that too." Margaret nodded slowly, as if Catherine had passed some small test. "Good," she said. "Then you also know that the evening isn't over." Catherine looked at her carefully. "What does that mean?" But Margaret had already moved away, slipping back into the crowd without any apparent hurry, greeting an elderly judge on her left with a warm handshake and a smile, leaving Catherine standing at the bar with a glass of sparkling water and a feeling she could not quite name. Not hope exactly, something quieter than hope, something more patient. At 45 minutes past 9, Harrison Sterling took the small stage at the end of the ballroom. A microphone had been set up. Though he didn't really need it, he was a man who had never had trouble projecting. The string quartet stopped playing. The crowd gathered, champagne in hand, faces tilted expectantly upward. Harrison smiled out at the room. 20 years ago, he began. This estate was a project, a vision, something I built from nothing. From nothing, Catherine thought. She stood in the back of the crowd and thought about the architectural plans spread across her kitchen table, about the nights she had spent on the phone with contractors, about the garden she had designed herself, species by species, before anyone had ever thought to take a photograph of it. And tonight, Harrison continued, I want to share some news with the people who matter most in my life. He reached out and took Brittany's hand, drawing her up beside him. The room murmured. People shifted. Several guests exchanged glances. Brittany and I, Harrison said, are engaged. The reaction was complicated. There was applause, but it was the careful, uncertain kind, the applause of people who weren't sure what the correct response was and were buying time. A few women near the front looked genuinely delighted. Others further back went very still. Catherine did not move. Brittany raised her left hand, the diamond ring catching the light, and the room quieted again. I want to say something else, Harrison continued. This estate, this home. He paused dramatically. It's going through some changes. A new chapter. We're going to renovate the East Wing, modernize the whole property, make it something... He glanced in the general direction of where Catherine was standing, worthy of the future rather than the past. It was skillfully done. He had not said her name. He had not pointed. But every person in that room understood exactly who the past referred to. Catherine heard a woman, 2 people to her right, inhale sharply. She heard someone behind her whisper, "That's brutal." And then a man's voice, low and uncomfortable, "Does he have to do it like this?" She stood there and absorbed it. Every word, every implication. And she thought about something Lucas had said to her 6 months ago in a very different kind of room. They always celebrate too early, he had said. That's the thing about people who mistake silence for defeat. They think the quiet means it's over. They never realize the quiet is when the real work gets done. She had not fully understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. After Harrison's speech, the dynamics of the room shifted in ways that were both predictable and painful. People who had been warm with Catherine all evening began to drift away. Not rudely. No one was ever rude at events like this. But suddenly there were other conversations to have, other people to find, other corners of the ballroom that required their attention. The senator's wife, who had touched Catherine's arm so warmly an hour ago, was now deep in conversation with someone across the room and didn't look up when Catherine walked past. This was how it worked. This was the social machinery of wealthy circles. Everyone waited to see which way the wind was blowing, and then everyone moved in that direction at once with perfect, synchronized casualness, as if the movement had been entirely their own idea. Catherine walked to the windows and looked out at the garden. Her garden. She had planted the wisteria along the south fence herself on a Saturday afternoon in April, 7 years into the marriage, when she had still believed that things like wisteria and shared gardens and a home you built together meant something permanent. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, and then she heard Brittany's voice behind her, not speaking to her, but near enough that the words were impossible to miss. Honestly, I don't understand why she even came. If my ex-husband replaced me, I would have some self-respect, you know. Brittany laughed. The woman she was speaking to laughed nervously. But I guess when you have nothing else to go back to. Catherine turned around. Brittany saw her immediately and did not look even slightly embarrassed. She simply met Catherine's gaze and smiled. "Oh, sorry," she said in a tone that made it clear she was not. "Were we talking too loud?" The woman Brittany had been speaking with looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Catherine looked at Brittany for a long moment. "That ring," she said quietly, "belonged to Margaret Sterling's mother. It was placed in a protected family trust in 1987. It requires unanimous trustee approval to transfer." She paused. "How many trustees approved giving it to you?" The smile on Brittany's face flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Then it returned, wider than before. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly. "Harrison gave it to me." "He gave you something?" Catherine agreed pleasantly. "Whether he had the legal authority to give it is a different question." And she walked away. Behind her, she heard Brittany say something, probably something sharp and dismissive, but she didn't hear the words because she wasn't listening anymore. She was moving through the room with a very clear sense of where she was going. She was going to find Margaret Sterling. She found her not in the ballroom, but in the hallway just outside the long portrait gallery that led toward the library wing, lined with oil paintings of Sterling family ancestors going back 4 generations. Margaret was standing in front of one of them, a portrait of a woman in Victorian dress with severe eyes and unexpectedly kind hands. "My grandmother-in-law," Margaret said, without turning around when she heard Catherine's footsteps. "Eleanor Sterling. She built the original version of this house. Did you know that—" "I did," Catherine said. "Harrison doesn't." Margaret finally turned. "He believes the male line built everything. He has always believed that despite considerable evidence to the contrary." She studied Catherine's face. "You said something to the girl." "I pointed out the trust document situation." "Good." Margaret nodded. "Plant the seed early." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He announced the engagement." "Yes." "And the renovation plans." "Yes." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened very slightly. "He is going to be extraordinarily surprised," she said, "when he discovers the scope of what he doesn't know." Catherine looked at her carefully. "Margaret, what have you done?" The older woman tilted her head slightly in the way of someone deciding exactly how much to reveal. "I haven't done anything yet," she said. "Tonight, I am simply a guest at a charity event, watching my son make choices." She paused. "The doing comes later, when the moment is right." "And when is that?" Margaret glanced back toward the ballroom, where the sound of Harrison's laughter rose above the ambient noise of 300 guests. "Soon," she said quietly. "Very soon." She patted Catherine's hand once, a brief, dry, decisive gesture, and then walked away down the hall, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Catherine stood alone in the portrait gallery, surrounded by generations of Sterling women who had built things that men later tried to claim. She looked up at Eleanor Sterling's painted face, and for the first time all evening she felt something that was very close to calm. Not peace, not victory, not yet, but the particular grounded stillness of a person who knows that the night is not over, and that the most important things, the things that actually determine what happens when the dust settles, and the guests go home and the chandeliers go dark, have not yet been revealed. Catherine Monroe straightened her shoulders. She walked back toward the ballroom, and whatever happened next, she was ready. Catherine walked back into the ballroom, and the first thing she noticed was that the music had changed. The string quartet had shifted from classical pieces to something softer, more ambient background noise, designed to fill silence without demanding attention. The kind of music you play when the real entertainment of the evening has already happened and everyone is simply waiting to go home. Except the evening was not over, not even close. She took a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her second of the night, which was one more than she usually allowed herself at Sterling events, and moved to a position near the center of the room where she could see everything without being the focal point of anything. This was a skill she had refined over 2 decades. How to be present and invisible at the same time. How to watch without appearing to watch. Harrison was holding court near the fireplace. He had a circle of 6 or 7 men around him, the kind of men who laughed at things before they were finished, being said, who nodded with the eager energy of people performing their own loyalty. Brittany stood beside him with her hand resting on his arm, the diamond catching light every time she moved, which was frequently. She had learned Catherine noticed how to move in a way that made the ring visible, a slight rotation of the wrist. A small, graceful gesture that lifted her hand just slightly above the natural resting position. She had practiced that too. Catherine watched all of it and felt something she had not expected to feel tonight, which was a deep and complicated sadness. Not for herself, not for Harrison, but for the whole machinery of it, the performance, the calculation, the way these 2 people were working so hard to construct an image of triumph that neither of them seemed to actually feel. Because if they had felt it, really felt it, they wouldn't have needed to work this hard. Joy doesn't perform. Only insecurity performs. She was thinking this when a hand touched her elbow. She turned. The man standing beside her was not someone she recognized immediately. Late 40s, medium height, wearing a tuxedo that was expensive but not flashy, with dark eyes that were doing the same thing Catherine's eyes were doing, watching the room while appearing to watch nothing. "You're Catherine Monroe," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said carefully. "Lucas Vance," he said. "I don't think we've met in person." He paused. "But I've been following your work for quite some time." She studied his face. Something shifted in her memory, not a face, but a name. A name she had seen in legal documents, in financial reports, in a specific email chain that had passed through her office 4 months ago regarding a forensic audit of Sterling Tech's 3rd quarter filings. "You're the forensic accountant," she said slowly. "Financial strategist," he said with a very slight smile. "The word forensic tends to make people in rooms like this nervous. You're working for, let's not say names," he said pleasantly, glancing around the room with the casual ease of someone who had done this kind of thing many times before. "Not here, not tonight." He took a sip of his drink. "I just wanted to introduce myself, and to tell you that you looked for a moment out there like you might leave." She looked at him steadily. "I considered it." "I'm glad you didn't." He said it simply without drama. "The next hour is going to matter, and it's going to matter that you were in the room when it happened." Catherine felt something tighten in her chest. What's going to happen in the next hour? He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Nothing that isn't already in motion, nothing that hasn't been carefully prepared." He set his glass down on a passing tray. "Margaret Sterling is a remarkable woman." And then he excused himself, moving away into the crowd with the unhurried ease of someone who had said exactly as much as he intended to say. Catherine stood very still and processed what had just happened. Lucas Vance, forensic financial strategist. The name connected to documents she had signed, to meetings she had attended, to a strategy that had been built. She understood now, not in weeks but in months, perhaps longer. She had thought she was moving alone through this night. She was beginning to understand that she had never been alone in this at all. Across the room, she saw Margaret Sterling settle into a chair near the small stage where Harrison had given his speech. An older man, she recognized him as Judge Arthur Whitfield, a family friend of the Sterlings for 40 years, sat down beside her. They appeared to be having a perfectly pleasant conversation. Margaret laughed at something he said. The judge laughed too. It looked like nothing. Catherine was learning to look past what things looked like. 15 minutes passed. The room continued its elaborate social choreography, clusters of conversations forming and dissolving, the waitstaff moving in practiced patterns, the ambient hum of 300 people performing their most comfortable versions of themselves for each other's benefit. And then Brittany made her mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind of mistake that only matters in the right context, in front of the right people. But timing, as Catherine's father had once told her, is everything. Timing is the difference between a match and a fire. Brittany had separated from Harrison briefly. He was deep in conversation with two tech executives and had apparently forgotten to remain aware of where she was. And she had drifted toward the portrait gallery hallway where Catherine had stood with Margaret 30 minutes earlier. She had a small group around her two younger women, a man Catherine didn't recognize, and a gossip columnist named Diane Marsh, who wrote a social page for a Connecticut magazine, and who had, Catherine knew, a particular gift for amplifying exactly the wrong things at exactly the right moments. Brittany was talking about the mansion, not just talking, describing, with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone who already thinks of a space as theirs. "The East Wing is going to be completely gutted," she was saying. "Harrison says it's been badly managed for years. The whole interior design philosophy is honestly, I don't know how to say this politely, very dated. Very much a certain kind of woman's taste from like 15 years ago." She laughed. "We're going to do something much cleaner, more modern, actually bring the house into this century." Diane Marsh was writing something in a small notebook. "What about the gardens?" one of the younger women asked. "Landscaped," Brittany said with a wave of her hand. "Fresh start. The whole South Garden is basically a mess right now. I'm thinking something much more structured, formal, European." She smiled. "Harrison says I can redesign the whole property. It'll basically be a new house by the time we're done." Catherine had stopped moving through the room. She was standing close enough to hear clearly, far enough to be outside the natural field of the group's attention. And she was listening to Brittany describe tearing out her wisteria and her garden and her carefully chosen stonework with the casual authority of someone who had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath her feet was not hers. Diane Marsh looked up from her notebook and saw Catherine standing there. The two women locked eyes for just a fraction of a second. Diane Marsh was too good a journalist not to recognize a story when one was standing directly in front of her. Catherine gave her the smallest possible nod, barely perceptible nothing anyone could point to later, and moved away. She found a quiet corner near the window, pulled out her phone, and sent a single text message to a number she had saved under a first name only. It said, "She's talking to Diane Marsh about renovating the property." The response came back in under 30 seconds. "Perfect. 20 minutes. Catherine put her phone away. 20 minutes. She looked across the room at Harrison still laughing with his tech executives. At Brittany still performing for Diane Marsh's notebook. At the 300 guests who had gathered tonight to witness what Harrison Sterling had intended to be a coronation. She thought about something her mother had told her when she was 12 years old after a school incident where another girl had publicly humiliated her in front of the whole class. Catherine had come home furious, wanting to fight, wanting to retaliate immediately, wanting to do something loud and visible and angry. Her mother had sat her down at the kitchen table and said, "The people who genuinely have power don't have to announce it, baby. They just use it, quietly, at the right moment. And the moment is everything." 20 minutes. Catherine walked to the bar and ordered another sparkling water because she needed to be completely clear-headed for whatever was about to happen, and she stood there and she waited. The first thing she noticed at exactly 18 minutes later was that Margaret Sterling had stood up from her chair. It was not a dramatic gesture. She didn't raise her voice or signal for attention. She simply stood, said something to Judge Whitfield, and walked calmly toward the small stage. A few people noticed, then a few more. The conversations in her immediate vicinity began to quiet the way conversations do when someone whose presence carries weight begins to move with purpose. By the time Margaret reached the stage and turned to face the room, perhaps a third of the guests had already oriented themselves toward her. The rest followed within seconds the way crowds always do, reading the room's energy-adjusting direction without fully understanding why. Harrison noticed. Catherine watched his face from across the room, the moment he realized his mother was on the stage. The brief flicker of something uncertain that crossed his expression before he replaced it with easy confidence. He said something to the men around him, excusing himself, and began moving toward the front of the room. Brittany materialized at his side within moments, her hand finding his arm. Margaret looked out at the room with an expression of complete composure. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said. Her voice carried without the microphone. She had never needed one. The Sterling Family Gala has been a tradition in this community for 40 years. It has always been at its heart about legacy, about what we build and about what we protect. There was polite applause. Harrison was almost to the front of the crowd now. He was smiling the smile of a man who assumes that whatever his mother is about to say will be supportive or at least harmless. "Tonight," Margaret continued, "I need to make several things clear, not because I enjoy causing disruption." She paused, and something in her voice shifted just slightly to something with more steel underneath it. "But because the truth has a way of creating its own disruption if you don't attend to it first." The room's energy changed. That was the only way Catherine could describe it, a change in the room's energy, like the pressure drop before a storm. The ambient noise didn't disappear, but it receded, and 290 people simultaneously gave Margaret Sterling their complete attention. Harrison stopped moving. "The diamond ring," Margaret said clearly, "currently on Brittany Vane's finger." The room went absolutely silent. Brittany's hand moved an involuntary gesture, almost protective, toward her chest. "That ring," Margaret continued, "is registered property of the Sterling Family Heritage Trust, established in 1987 under Article 7 of the Family Estate Agreement. It requires documented unanimous approval from all 3 trustees before it may be transferred, loaned, or otherwise removed from the trust vault for any purpose including gift." She looked directly at her son. "Harrison, how many trustees approved that transfer?" Harrison's face had gone very still. "Mother." "How many?" Margaret repeated. Gentle. Absolute. The silence in that room was the kind of silence that has weight to it. Harrison said nothing. "0, Margaret said quietly, "because no approval was sought. Because my son removed a protected family heirloom from a legally binding trust without authorization and placed it on this young woman's finger as a public gesture of ownership." She paused. "The only problem is that he does not have the authority to give away what does not belong to him." Brittany was staring at Margaret with an expression that had gone from shock to a particular kind of dawning sick understanding. "The ring," Margaret said to Brittany directly, "will need to be returned to the trust vault this evening. I apologize to you personally. You were given something under false pretenses, and that was not fair to you." The graciousness of that was devastating. It removed any possibility of Brittany appearing as a victim. Because Margaret had just made clear with perfect civility that Brittany was not the wronged party here, she was simply a recipient of something stolen. Brittany, slowly in front of every person in that room, removed the ring from her finger. Her hands were shaking slightly. A Sterling family attorney, a man named Douglas Park, who had been a guest at the gala and who was now visibly not having the quiet evening he had anticipated, stepped forward and accepted the ring in a small velvet case that he had apparently brought with him, which meant Margaret had known, had prepared, had organized every piece of this in advance. Harrison's face was white. "There's more," Margaret said, not triumphantly, not with any visible satisfaction, simply stating a fact. "The executor status of family assets which Harrison has held since 2019 has been reviewed by the trust board. Given recent financial activity that constitutes a breach of fiduciary responsibility, that status has been suspended pending investigation." "You cannot do that," Harrison said. His voice was low, but in that silence it carried everywhere. "The trust board voted this afternoon," Margaret said simply. "It's already done." "This afternoon?" Harrison took a step forward. "You planned this. You planned this tonight. You set this up." "I protected the family," Margaret said, "which is what I have always done." She looked at him steadily. "Sit down, Harrison." He did not sit down, but he stopped moving. And then something happened that not even Catherine had been fully prepared for. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened and Lucas Vance walked in. He was not alone. He was accompanied by 2 people carrying document folders, and beside him, walking with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment, was a woman Catherine recognized as Eleanor Choi, one of the most prominent corporate attorneys in the state of Connecticut. The room parted for them instinctively. Lucas walked to the front without stopping, placed a document folder on the small table beside the stage, and looked up at the room with the composed expression of a man who was simply here to deliver information. "My name is Lucas Vance," he said. I am a certified forensic financial strategist, and I have been conducting an independent audit of Sterling Tech Holdings for the past 14 months, at the request of the company's majority shareholder. Harrison made a sound. It was not quite a word. Sterling Tech has 47% of its shares held in a blind trust, Lucas continued. That trust was established in 2009 at the founding of the company by the original architect of the corporate structure. He opened the folder. The controlling shareholder of that trust, the individual who holds majority decision-making authority over Sterling Tech's board actions, executive appointments, and corporate direction, is Catherine Elizabeth Monroe. The room detonated. Not loudly, not in the way of explosions in movies, but in the way of real human shock. A collective, involuntary sound, a surge of movement, heads turning, people grabbing each other's arms, the rapid whispered exchange of disbelief in every corner of that space. Harrison turned and found Catherine across the room. And for the first time all evening, for perhaps the first time in their entire marriage, he looked at her and did not see what he expected to see. She met his gaze and held it. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. She simply looked at him with the steady, direct gaze of a woman who had spent 22 years being underestimated by exactly this man, in exactly this house, surrounded by exactly these people. "That's not possible," Harrison said. His voice had lost its certainty. "That's not I built that company. I know every document, every share structure." "You knew what you were shown?" Lucas said simply. "The blind trust was specifically structured to maintain anonymity. Ms. Monroe has been the controlling shareholder since the company's founding. The board was notified this afternoon." Brittany was no longer touching Harrison's arm. She had taken a half step back, not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable to anyone who was watching, which was everyone. "Furthermore," Lucas continued, and Catherine watched Harrison's face absorb the word "furthermore" with something that looked almost like physical pain. "The audit has identified a pattern of financial misconduct in the management of company assets dating back to the fiscal year 2021. Under the shareholder agreement, documented misconduct by the CEO triggers an automatic review clause." He looked up from his documents. An emergency board vote was conducted by remote session at 5 p.m. This afternoon, the vote was unanimous. He paused. In that pause, Catherine heard someone in the crowd whisper, "Oh my God." "Harrison Sterling has been removed as CEO of Sterling Tech Holdings effective immediately," Lucas said. "Ms. Monroe, as controlling shareholder, will oversee the transition management." The room was beyond silent now. It was the particular silence of people who are witnessing something so much larger than they expected that their usual social responses have simply stopped working. Harrison stood in the center of it all, and for a moment he looked like what he actually was underneath. Everything, a man who had confused the appearance of power for power itself. A man who had spent 20 years standing in rooms that other people built and calling them his own. He turned to Catherine. And what he said in that full room, in that silence with 300 people, and Diane Marsh's notebook, and the remains of his public coronation all around him, was this: "You wouldn't." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. "Harrison," she said quietly, "I just did." The 3 words hung in the air between them like smoke. "I just did." Catherine did not raise her voice. She did not move toward him. She simply stood where she was in the center of the room that she had built, and he had tried to take and let those 3 words do the work that 22 years of silence never could. Harrison's face went through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief first, then a flash of something that looked almost like admiration, quickly buried under fury. Then the particular expression of a man who has just realized in a room full of witnesses that the ground he has been standing on was never his to begin with. He turned to Lucas. "This is a setup," he said. His voice was controlled, but Catherine could hear the fracture underneath it, the way you can hear a crack in old wood before it splits. "You walked in here with paperwork you prepared in advance. This was coordinated. This was documented," Lucas said calmly. "Every finding in this audit is documented, dated, and independently verified. You're welcome to have your attorneys review the full package. We anticipated that request." He gestured to the woman beside him. "Eleanor Choi is here to facilitate any immediate legal questions." Eleanor Choi, who had the composed expression of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and found them entirely manageable, nodded professionally. Harrison looked at her, then at Lucas, then at his mother, who was still standing on the stage with the quiet authority of a woman who had made her decision long ago and was simply watching it arrive. "You did this," Harrison said to Margaret. Not a question, an accusation. The voice of a son who has just discovered that the person he assumed was always on his side had been quietly, methodically working against everything he thought he had built. "You went behind my back, my own mother." Margaret's expression did not change. "I went in front of the truth," she said, "which is exactly where I have always stood." "The truth?" He almost laughed. It came out wrong. "Your version of the truth. Your—" "Harrison." Her voice dropped just slightly, and the change in tone stopped him, the way a wall stops a car. She looked at her son with something that was not cruelty, and was not indifference, but was the precise, exhausted clarity of a woman who loved someone and was no longer willing to protect him from the consequences of who he had chosen to be. "Sit down, right now, before you say something in this room that you cannot take back." The silence around them was absolute. 300 people were holding their breath, and Harrison Sterling, who had walked into this room 3 hours ago believing the night was his, sat down. Not gracefully, not willingly, but he sat. Brittany had moved. Catherine registered this without looking directly at her, a peripheral awareness the way you notice weather changing without checking the sky. Brittany had drifted back from Harrison's side 2 steps, then 3, until she was standing slightly apart from him in a way that was subtle enough to deny but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. She had her champagne glass pressed to her lips, and she was staring at a fixed point somewhere above the crowd, and her expression was doing the complicated work of a woman rapidly reassessing every decision that had brought her to this specific moment. Catherine knew that look. She had worn it herself once, a long time ago, when she had first understood the nature of what she had married into. She felt no satisfaction watching Brittany wear it now, only something tired and honest, something that recognized itself. Lucas stepped down from the stage area and moved to Catherine's side. He spoke quietly close enough that only she could hear. The board notification went through at 5:17. The vote was 5-0. His own people voted him out. "Who abstained?" she asked, equally quiet. "No one. It was unanimous." She absorbed that. 5-0. Men who had shaken Harrison's hand at dinners, who had played golf at his club, who had smiled across boardroom tables for a decade. 5-0. "He'll fight it," she said. "Of course he will," Lucas said. "That's why we spent 14 months making sure every document is airtight." He paused. "Eleanor's team has already filed the emergency injunction freezing the executive accounts. He won't be able to move assets tonight." Catherine nodded slowly. She was listening to him, but part of her attention was still on the room, on the dozens of individual dramas playing out in real time. The whispered conversations, the people pulling out phones, the subtle reshuffling of social allegiances that was happening right in front of her eyes. People who had avoided her all evening were now looking at her differently, not all of them with warmth, some with calculation, some with genuine surprise, but differently. The way you look at something when you finally understand what it actually is. Across the room near the portrait gallery entrance, she caught sight of Diane Marsh. The columnist had her phone out now and was typing rapidly with both thumbs, her small notebook abandoned in favor of the faster medium. Whatever she was writing, it would be published within the hour. These things moved fast when they moved. Margaret descended from the stage. She moved through the crowd with the deliberate unhurriedness of a woman who has nothing left to prove tonight, and she came directly to Catherine. She took both of Catherine's hands in hers. Her grip was dry and firm. "Are you all right?" she asked. Just those 3 words. But the weight in them, the history, the years of quiet communication between 2 women who had understood each other in a household that did not always make space for understanding, made Catherine's throat tighten in a way she had not expected. "Yes," Catherine said, and then more honestly, "ask me again in an hour." Something moved in Margaret's eyes that might in someone less composed have been described as the moment before tears. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for longer than tonight, for things that should have been said and done years earlier." "You did it now," Catherine said. "I should have done it sooner." "Margaret," Catherine squeezed her hands once. "You did it now, that's what matters." The older woman held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Once. The kind of nod that closes something and opens something else at the same time. She turned and walked to where Judge Whitfield was standing and resumed a conversation that looked from the outside entirely ordinary. Margaret Sterling had the gift Catherine had always admired it of making the extraordinary look routine. Lucas touched Catherine's elbow lightly. "He's getting up." Harrison had risen from his chair. He was on his phone now, pacing a tight, controlled circle near the fireplace, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone who was. Catherine imagined a very expensive attorney having a very bad evening. His face had rearranged itself from shock into a controlled anger that was in some ways more dangerous than the open fury had been. She watched him and thought, he's not finished fighting. He won't be finished fighting for a long time. That was fine. She had built for the long game. She had been building for it since long before tonight. 15 minutes passed. The room had not returned to its earlier party configuration. It had shifted into something else entirely, the kind of suspended social state where everyone is present, but the usual rules don't quite apply. People clustered in small groups, talking intently. The waitstaff continued their rounds with admirable professionalism, offering champagne to people who were holding full glasses and not noticing. And then Harrison finished his phone call. He put his phone in his jacket pocket. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the room with the assessing gaze of a man taking stock of his remaining options, and then he walked toward Catherine. Lucas shifted slightly to her left, a small protective repositioning that she acknowledged and did not need, but appreciated. She touched his arm briefly gently, and he understood she would handle this part herself. Harrison stopped in front of her. For a moment he just looked at her and she looked back, and there was a strange intimacy to it. The intimacy of two people who had shared a bed and a life and a company for 22 years, and were now standing on opposite sides of something that could not be unmade. "How long?" he said. She knew what he was asking. "The blind trust since 2009, since the founding documents." 17 years. He said it like a number he was trying to make sense of. 17 years, and I never... "You never looked," she said. "You saw what you expected to see. You expected to see me managing what you'd given me permission to manage. So that's what you saw." His jaw tightened. "That is not... Harrison." She kept her voice even, quiet, almost gentle, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing she could have offered him right now. "You called me old history tonight, in front of everyone in this room. You said the house needed to be made worthy of the future instead of the past." She paused. "I built this house. I built the company. I was always the architect. You just never bothered to read the blueprints." Something crossed his face that she had not seen there in many years, something genuine and unperformed and almost human. "Why didn't you—" He stopped, started again. "Why did you let me believe—" "Because I loved you," she said simply. "For a long time I loved you, and I thought that what we were building together was more important than who got credit for it." She looked at him steadily. "I was wrong about that. It took me a while to understand why." He stared at her. "You never saw me," she said. "Not really. And when someone doesn't see you when they look at you, and only see a reflection of themselves, an accessory, a supporting role in their own story, eventually you have to decide, do you keep making yourself small enough to fit that frame, or do you step out of it entirely?" The silence between them stretched. "I have to contest this," Harrison said finally. "You understand that. I have to fight the board decision, the trust audit, all of it. My attorneys—" "I know," she said. "Fight it. You have every right to. That's how the process works." She met his eyes. "But Harrison, the documents are real. The vote was real. The majority shareholder is real." A beat. "I am real. I have always been real. Tonight you just finally had to look at me." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. She watched him go, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was grief, not for the marriage, not for the betrayal, not even for the years she had spent being invisible in her own life, but for the simpler thing underneath all of it. For the two people, they might have been in a different version of events if he had ever once looked up from his own reflection long enough to really see her. That grief lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then she put it somewhere quiet inside herself and turned back to the room. Lucas was beside her. "You okay?" "Yes," she meant it this time. "There's something else you need to know," he said. His tone had shifted slightly, not alarming, but careful. the tone of someone delivering information they've been holding until the right moment. She looked at him. "The mansion deed?" he said. "We haven't gotten to that part yet." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean, the estate is in Harrison's name? It was part of the divorce settlement. He retained the property. I received the investment portfolio." "That's what the settlement document says," Lucas agreed. "That's what everyone was told." He paused. "But 14 months ago, when Margaret retained me to begin the audit, one of the first things she asked me to examine was the property chain of title, the deed history going back to the original purchase." Catherine was very still. "In 2011, Lucas said, Margaret Sterling executed a transfer of the estate deed into a protected family trust, a separate trust from the one holding the ring and the other heirlooms, a real estate holding trust structured specifically to protect the property from personal financial liability." He looked at her directly. "The named beneficiary of that trust as of 2014, when Margaret amended the trust documents, is you." The room around her continued its noise and its movement and its complicated social aftermath. Catherine heard none of it. "The divorce settlement," she said slowly, "was negotiated based on the assumption that Harrison owned the property outright." "Correct," Lucas said, "but he didn't. He couldn't transfer clear title because he didn't have clear title to transfer. The settlement as it pertains to the property was built on a false premise, which means the property disposition clause of the divorce settlement is legally voidable." Eleanor Choi said, appearing at Catherine's other side with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been listening from just outside the conversation and had timed her entry perfectly. "We filed the challenge this afternoon simultaneously with the board action. The court will review within 60 days, but based on the trust documentation, which is clean, properly executed, and has been on file with the state since 2011, the likely outcome is straightforward." Catherine looked from Eleanor to Lucas and back again. "She knew," she said, not angry, not even fully surprised, more like the feeling of a puzzle piece clicking into place that you've been turning in your hands for a long time. Margaret knew in 2014 what was coming. She protected the property before any of this happened. "She protected you," Lucas said quietly. "She's been protecting you for 12 years. She just needed time to gather enough to make it stick." Catherine turned and found Margaret across the room. The older woman was still talking to Judge Whitfield, but as if she felt Catherine's gaze, she looked up, and for just a moment across the crowded, charged, complicated wreckage of the evening, Harrison had planned the two women looked at each other. Margaret's expression was composed as ever, but her eyes said everything that composed expressions cannot say. "I saw you. I always saw you." Catherine's chest did something complicated. She nodded once. Margaret nodded back. And then Harrison, who had retreated to the far end of the room with his phone pressed to his ear and his composed anger still wrapped around him like armor, said something to someone beside him that was clearly not meant to carry, but did in the strange acoustics of a room that had gone too quiet too fast. "Someone get me Douglas Park," he said sharply. "I need my attorney right now, not in 20 minutes now, and find out where Brittany went." The last sentence landed oddly in the air, because several people in that room had already noticed what Harrison apparently had not. Brittany Vane was no longer in the ballroom. Someone near Catherine said, "She left, like 10 minutes ago." And someone else said a little more quietly, "I saw her get her coat from the coat room. She called a car." Harrison heard it. Catherine watched him hear it. The small freeze in his body, the recalibration, the moment of processing what it meant that the woman he had brought into this room as a declaration of victory had left without telling him she was going. He did not break down. He was Harrison Sterling, and he did not do that in public. But the room watched his face for just long enough to see the information land, and that was enough. In a room like this with people like these, that was more than enough. Lucas leaned close to Catherine. "Security is on the way. There are 2 Greenwich PD officers outside. This is still technically a private property matter, and given the deed situation, that gives us grounds to formally request that he vacate the premises pending the court review." Catherine absorbed this. "He's going to be removed from his own house." "From the house he believed was his," Lucas corrected gently. She looked around the room at the chandelier she had chosen, the stonework. She had approved the garden she could see through the dark windows, her wisteria on the south fence, where she had planted it with her own hands on a Saturday in April 17 years ago. "This house," she said quietly, has not been his for a very long time. No, Lucas agreed. It hasn't. The doors at the main entrance opened. Two men in uniform stepped inside. Douglas Park, the Sterling family attorney who had accepted the ring into his velvet case earlier in the evening, moved to intercept them, a brief professional exchange, the presentation of documents, the careful review of paperwork in real time. Harrison saw the officers. He turned and found Catherine across the room with the look of a man who is searching for something to hold on to and finding only air. "Catherine," he said. His voice had changed. The controlled anger was still there, but underneath it now was something raw, something she recognized with complicated feeling as fear. "Catherine, we can talk about this. We can find a way to—" "I'll have Priya contact your attorneys in the morning," she said, professionally, without cruelty. "Everything goes through legal channels from here." "Catherine?" "Good night, Harrison," she said. She turned away, and she did not look back. She turned away from Harrison and did not look back, and in that single act of not looking back, something inside Catherine Monroe that had been clenched tight for years, maybe decades, slowly, carefully began to release. Not all at once, not dramatically. It was more like the feeling of setting down something very heavy after carrying it for so long that you had stopped noticing the weight. You only understood how heavy it had been when your hands were finally empty. The room around her was still charged with everything that had just happened, 300 people processing the same extraordinary sequence of events, everyone arriving at their own conclusions, at their own speed. The social surface of the gala had been completely disrupted, and in its place was something rawer and more honest, the kind of atmosphere that only exists in a room full of people who have just witnessed something real. Something they could not perform a reaction to because the reaction had already happened involuntarily before anyone could compose themselves. Lucas stayed close to her left side, not crowding her. Just present the way a good ally is present there if needed, unobtrusive if not. "Douglas Park is talking to the officers," he said quietly. "He's trying to buy Harrison time to leave voluntarily, save some face." "Will it work?" Catherine asked. "The officers have the court filings. The deed challenged the asset freeze the board removal. They're not here to make a scene. They're here to ensure the property is secured, pending the legal review." He paused. "Harrison has about 10 minutes to make a graceful exit before it stops being his choice." Catherine nodded. She did not watch Harrison. She made a conscious, deliberate choice to let that part of the evening happen without her as an audience, because she understood in a way she couldn't have understood 5 years ago that her attention was not nothing. Her attention was currency, and she was done spending it on him. Instead, she turned toward a small cluster of guests who had been drifting in her direction with the careful, tentative energy of people who wanted to approach but weren't certain of their welcome. The senator's wife, the same woman who had touched her arm warmly at the beginning of the evening and then melted away after Harrison's speech, was at the front of the group. She had the grace at least to look uncomfortable about it. "Catherine," she said, "I just want to say what happened tonight. I had no idea. None of us had any idea." "Of course not," Catherine said pleasantly. "How would you have—" The senator's wife blinked, visibly uncertain whether she was being forgiven or gently eviscerated. The answer was neither. Catherine simply had no energy left for performance in any direction. "I owe you an apology," the woman said more directly. "For earlier. For the way when he gave his speech, You read the room," Catherine said. "Everyone does. It's a social survival skill." She looked at the woman steadily. "I don't hold it against you, but I do notice it. That's all." The senator's wife absorbed this with the expression of someone receiving a small, precise, well-deserved correction, and nodded. "Fair enough," she said quietly. "Fair enough." Another woman stepped forward, someone Catherine knew less well, the wife of a hedge fund manager who ran in the outer rings of the Sterling social circle. She held out her hand, and when Catherine took it, she gripped it with both of hers and said simply, "Well done." 2 words, no further explanation offered or needed. Catherine thanked her and moved on. These small interactions happened in rapid succession over the next several minutes. Brief charged the social recalibration of a room in real time. Some people were warm, some were calculating. A few were genuinely moved. One man, a tech executive she had met 3 times in a professional context, pulled her aside briefly and said very quietly, "I want to talk to you next week about Sterling Tech, about where it goes from here. I think there's an opportunity." She smiled. "Have your office call Priya." He nodded, impressed, and moved away. This was the thing about power she was learning, really understanding it in her body, not just her mind. It has a gravity to it. When it's genuinely present, people feel it without being told to feel it. They orient toward it the way a compass orients toward north, not because they've been instructed to, but because something in them recognizes it. She had always had this gravity. She had simply spent 2 decades allowing someone else to stand in front of it. It was Priya who texted her at 10:47, reading Diane Marsh just posted. "It's already being picked up." Catherine read the message and put her phone away without clicking the link. She would read it later. Right now, she was here, present, in this room. She had waited long enough for this night that she was not going to spend the most important part of it staring at a phone screen. 10 minutes later, Harrison left the building. She didn't see it happen. She heard it, or rather she felt the change in the room's energy that signaled it the subtle collective exhale, the sense of a pressure dropping. Someone near the entrance said something in a low voice, and someone else responded, and a small wave of that information spread outward through the crowd. Harrison Sterling had left the Sterling estate. He had walked out through the same entrance he had walked in through 3 hours ago, when he had been the man who owned this room, and he had gotten into a car, and he had driven away from the house he believed he had built. Without Brittany, without the ring, without the company, without the title, without anything that had not been his to begin with. Catherine stood in the center of the room and let the reality of that settle over her like something clean. Margaret appeared at her elbow. The older woman's composure was intact as ever, but her eyes were bright, and she held herself with the particular relief of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for a very important thing to finally be finished. "He's gone," Margaret said. "I know," Catherine said. "He called me a traitor," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "In the hallway before he left, he said I betrayed him." Catherine looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" "I've been called worse by better people," Margaret said, which was the kind of answer that was both a deflection and completely true. Then after a pause, "He's my son. I love him. That part doesn't change." She was quiet for a moment. "But love is not the same as protection from consequence. I muddled those two things for too long. I won't muddle them anymore." Catherine reached out and put her hand over Margaret's. "Come on," Margaret said, squaring her small shoulders. "There are people here who want to talk to you. Real conversations, the kind you've been cut off from for years." She looked at Catherine with something fierce and gentle at once. "You have an extraordinary amount of catching up to do." And she steered Catherine gently but firmly the way she did everything back into the room. What followed was unlike anything Catherine had experienced in the context of a Sterling event. Because for the first time in her memory, people were talking to her, not to Harrison through Catherine, not to the dutiful wife standing beside the CEO, not to the professionally supportive partner whose name they sometimes forgot, but to her, to the person she actually was. To the woman who had apparently been running one of the most significant technology companies in the Northeast from behind a blind trust for 17 years, without anyone who mattered being any the wiser. People had questions, real ones, about the company's direction, about the board restructuring, about what the next 12 months would look like for Sterling Tech under new management. These were serious questions from serious people, and Catherine answered them with the fluency of someone who had been thinking about these exact issues for 14 months, which she had. At 11:15, Lucas found her in the middle of a conversation with 2 board-adjacent investors and excused them both briefly, pulling her aside with the professional ease of a man who understood when urgency required interrupting a social moment. "Something's happened," he said. His voice was low and careful, the specific register he used when information was important and needed to be absorbed without public reaction. She looked at him directly. "Tell me." "Brittany Vane," he said. "She didn't just leave. Before she left, she had a 15-minute conversation in the coat room with Diane Marsh." Catherine was very still. "What kind of conversation?" "We don't know everything yet, but Marsh's second post, it went up 6 minutes ago, contains details that she could not have gotten from watching the room. Details about the blind trust structure, about the timing of the board vote, about certain—" He paused. choosing his words carefully, certain aspects of the financial audit that weren't made public tonight. Catherine processed this quickly. She's the leak. It appears so. Brittany knew about the audit. She may have known more about Harrison's internal situation than anyone realized, Lucas said. Or Harrison may have told her things he shouldn't have, or he hesitated. Or, Catherine said, or she was never purely Harrison's ally, he said. She came to this event tonight on Harrison's arm, but she left 14 minutes after the board removal was announced, called her own car, not one of Harrison's fleet, and stopped to talk to a journalist on her way out. He looked at Catherine steadily. That's not the behavior of a woman in shock. That's the behavior of a woman who had a contingency plan. Catherine took a slow breath. The layers of this evening were deeper than she had anticipated, and she had anticipated a great deal. "What is Marsh writing?" she asked. The second piece frames the story differently from the first. The first was straightforward rich man loses company at his own gala, controlling shareholder revealed. Very dramatic, very clear. The second piece is, he searched for the word murkier. It raises questions about the audit timeline, implies the board removal may have been rushed, suggests that the blind trust structure might be challenged on grounds that Catherine had material information advantages that Atnal. That's Harrison's legal strategy, Catherine said immediately. He's not even out of the driveway yet, and he's already feeding a counter-narrative. Through Brittany, Lucas confirmed, who has, I should point out, 2 million followers on social media and a very motivated interest in reframing tonight as something other than a story in which she publicly returned a ring and then left alone. Catherine was quiet for a moment. She thought about the coat room, about the 15 minutes, about a 29-year-old woman in a designer gown rapidly recalculating the value of her available options and making a choice. She thought about what she had said earlier tonight, watching Brittany's confident performance in the ballroom. Joy doesn't perform. Only insecurity performs. She had been right about that, but she had perhaps underestimated how skilled a performer Brittany Vane actually was, and how quickly that skill could be redirected when the original stage collapsed. "What do we do?" Lucas asked. Catherine thought for 3 seconds. "Nothing tonight," she said. "Tonight we let Marsh publish whatever she publishes. We don't respond. We don't counter. We don't engage. Responding tonight looks defensive, and we don't need to be defensive." She met his eyes. "The documents are real. The board vote is real. The trust is real. Brittany can talk to every journalist in Connecticut. None of that changes what's on paper." Lucas looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried." "I'm concerned," she corrected. "There's a difference. Worry is emotion without direction. Concern is paying attention to something that requires a measured response." She paused. "Tomorrow morning, have Eleanor's team draft a comprehensive press statement. Clean, factual, nothing inflammatory. Let the documents speak." Another pause. "And I want to know everything Brittany Vane knew about the audit timeline. Everything. Because if Harrison shared confidential board information with her before tonight, that's not a PR problem, that's a legal one. For him." Lucas's expression shifted slightly. The small shift of a person who has just seen someone operate and is genuinely impressed. "I'll have a research brief on her by 7 a.m. 6, Catherine said. He almost smiled. 6. She turned back to the room. Margaret was across the space holding court with her elegant iron-spined composure, telling a story that had 3 people leaning in and laughing. The string quartet had resumed playing someone at some point, had quietly signaled them to start again, and the room had accepted the music's return as permission to exhale. The gala was not over. It had simply become something else, something that none of the printed invitations had advertised, and none of the 300 guests would ever forget. Judge Whitfield approached Catherine with his champagne glass and his 30-year judge's face and the warm, measured expression of a man who chooses his words with the care of someone accustomed to their weight. "Extraordinary evening," he said. "Not the one anyone planned," she agreed. He considered. "I've known Margaret Sterling for 32 years. I've watched her navigate some extremely difficult situations with some extremely difficult people." He glanced across the room toward the older woman. "I've never seen her as settled as she looked tonight, standing up there." He looked back at Catherine. "She's been carrying something for a long time." "She has," Catherine said. People don't understand that about the long game, the judge said thoughtfully. They see the ending and think it happened quickly. They don't see the years, the patience, the thousand small decisions it takes to build something that holds. He raised his glass slightly. To the architects, he said quietly. Catherine raised her own glass. To the architects. They drank. At 11:52, Priya called. Catherine stepped into the hallway, the portrait gallery again. Eleanor Sterling's painted eyes watching from above and answered on the second ring. "How are you?" Priya asked immediately. Not professionally, but personally, the way someone asks when they genuinely need to know. "I'm standing," Catherine said. "That's not nothing," Priya said. "The Marsh pieces, I've seen both of them. The first one is basically on our side. The second one is messier." "I know. We're not responding tonight." "Good call." A pause. "The board chair called my line 20 minutes ago. He wants a preliminary call with you tomorrow at 8. "Put it on." "Done." Another pause. Then in a quieter voice, "Catherine, the number of calls and emails that have come into the main office line in the last 2 hours, companies, investors, journalists, people who want meetings, people who want comment, people who want—" "I know," Catherine said gently. "Do you—" "Because I've been your assistant for 6 years, and I've never seen anything like Priya." Catherine leaned her back against the cool wall of the portrait gallery and looked up at the ceiling. "I know, and we'll handle all of it, systematically, carefully, one thing at a time." A beat. "Starting at 6 a.m. Priya made a sound that was half laugh, half exhausted disbelief. "You're going to make me come in at 6. "I'll have coffee," Catherine said. "You'd better have coffee and a very good explanation for why I've been getting calls from 3 different news networks." "I'll explain everything at 6. She ended the call and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway with the ancestors watching and the sounds of the gala drifting from the ballroom and the cool air of October pressing against the estate's old walls. She was thinking about Brittany, not with anger, not with contempt, with something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. Because Brittany Vane had walked into this room tonight as Harrison's weapon, his declaration of replacement, his public performance of victory, and she had ended the evening talking to a journalist in a coat room, working her own angle, protecting her own story, surviving in the way that people survive when they suddenly find themselves standing on ground that has collapsed beneath them. Catherine understood something about that. She had done her own version of it in her own way for longer than Brittany had been an adult. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the sound of the music. And then something happened that she had not expected. One of the guests, a woman she did not recognize, mid-60s, wearing a simple dark dress and no significant jewelry, stepped into the hallway from a side door that Catherine hadn't noticed anyone using. The woman looked at Catherine with an expression of recognition that was clearly not mutual. "Forgive me," the woman said. "I know you don't know me. I'm Clara Whitfield Arthur's sister." Catherine extended her hand. "Catherine Monroe. I know who you are." The woman shook her hand firmly. "I've known who you were for 11 years. I was at the board meeting in 2015, the emergency meeting about the Singapore acquisition. I was there as Arthur's guest. The vote that night," she paused, "the vote that saved the company from a catastrophic overreach. It came from a motion filed by an anonymous majority shareholder." Catherine said nothing. "It was you," Clara said simply. "Wasn't it?" The question hung in the air. "The anonymous shareholder exercised their rights under the trust agreement," Catherine said carefully. Clara nodded slowly. "I've thought about that night many times over the years, about who had the knowledge and the positioning to see what that deal would have done to the company. Harrison was so certain. He was going to ram it through. And then this motion—" She shook her head slightly. "I asked Arthur about it afterward. He said the trust documents were airtight. He said whoever held that position understood the company at a level that was—" She paused. "That was well beyond what any passive investor should have known." Catherine met the woman's eyes. "I want you to know," Clara said, "that the company is in better hands now than it ever was." She held Catherine's gaze. "And I think a great many people in that room tonight more than will admit it publicly feel the same way." She gave a small, genuine nod and walked back through the side door. Catherine stood alone in the portrait gallery for the second time that night. She looked up at Eleanor Sterling's portrait. The severe eyes, the unexpectedly kind hands, The woman who had built the original version of this house and watched generations of men stand in it and call it theirs. "I see you," Catherine said quietly, "to the painting, to the history, to the years of women who had built things that other people named after themselves." Then she walked back into the ballroom. And the room, without any announcement, without any signal, without anything being orchestrated or planned, turned toward her. The way a room turns toward the person who is genuinely, undeniably, irrevocably at its center. Not because she commanded it, because she had earned it. Every room, every document, every silent year of it. Margaret Sterling caught her eye from across the space and raised her glass. Catherine raised hers. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she felt standing in the house she had built, in the company she had founded, in the life she had quietly, patiently, relentlessly refused to abandon completely, entirely, and without apology like herself. The last guests left the Sterling estate at 12:41 in the morning. Catherine knew the exact time because she was standing near the entrance when the final car pulled away, and she watched the taillights disappear down the quarter-mile approach lined with hedgerow, and she felt the particular silence that descends on a large space when the last human presence withdraws from it. Not an empty silence, a settled one. The silence of a place returning to itself after a long period of being used for something it was never quite meant for. Margaret was still there, and Lucas, and Eleanor Choi, who had the stamina and the professional discipline of someone who treated midnight the same way other people treated mid-afternoon. The four of them stood in the entrance hall, the marble floor, the high ceiling, the old chandelier that Catherine had chosen from a catalog in 2003, while Harrison was on a phone call and not paying attention, and the strange intimacy of the hour made everything feel more direct, more honest, more real than it had felt even in the charged atmosphere of the ballroom. "Sit down," Margaret said to Catherine. Not a suggestion. The gentle, absolute command of a woman who had been watching someone hold themselves together through sheer will for 4 hours and had decided that was enough. "You've been standing since 7 o'clock. Catherine sat. On the bench near the entrance where guests were supposed to sit, to wait for their cars to be brought around, which was not dignified, but was exactly right. Margaret sat beside her. Lucas leaned against the wall, loosening his tie with the quiet relief of a man who has been professionally composed for longer than is comfortable. Eleanor closed her document folder and sat across from them with the calm, anchored presence of someone who had seen a great many complicated evenings and had learned to let them decompress at their own pace. "What happens tomorrow?" Catherine asked. She meant it practically, not philosophically. She needed the practical shape of the next 24 hours before she could let herself stop working. Eleanor answered first, because this was her territory and she was precise about it. Harrison's attorneys will file for an emergency stay on the board decision that's standard expected, and it will not succeed given the documentation. The asset freeze holds through the weekend. The property deed challenge will be formally acknowledged by the court within the week. We expect Harrison to retain Gordon Hewitt's firm. She paused. Hewitt is expensive and aggressive, but he works with what he has. He won't have much. Timeline, Catherine said. The board transitions 60 to 90 days for full formalization, but you have operational authority effective immediately. The property matters 60 days minimum, likely closer to 90. Harrison will use every procedural tool available to slow the review. Eleanor met her eyes. He won't change the outcome. He'll only delay it. Catherine nodded. She had expected delays. She had planned for delays. The 14 months of preparation had not been about speed. They had been about depth. About building something so thoroughly documented and so legally airtight that delays were merely delays, not vulnerabilities. The Marsh situation, Lucas said. I had someone monitoring both pieces through the night. The second article, the one with Brittany's information, has gotten significantly less traction than the first. The first piece has been picked up by 11 major outlets. The second by 2, both of which are running it as analysis rather than news. The distinction matters. It means the primary narrative is already set, Catherine said. Exactly. What Brittany gave Marsh was noise. The documents were signal. People respond to signal. He paused. I also found out something about Brittany's conversation in the coat room that you should know. The room's attention sharpened. She wasn't just talking to Marsh, Lucas said. She was also on the phone before the Marsh conversation with someone whose number traces to a production company in Los Angeles, a reality television production company. The silence that followed lasted about 3 full seconds. Then Margaret said very dryly, "Well, at least she's efficient." Lucas almost laughed. She had a contingency plan, as I suspected. The phone call happened at 10:38, approximately 7 minutes after the board removal was announced. She moved very fast. Catherine absorbed this. A week ago, maybe even an hour ago, this information would have landed differently. It might have felt like a threat or an insult or another layer of the evening's chaos to manage. But sitting in the entrance hall at 12:40 in the morning, with the house quiet around her, and the hard part genuinely finally done, it landed as something else entirely. It landed as almost sad. A 29-year-old woman standing in a coat room in a borrowed gown with a ring she'd had to give back, calling a production company because the situation she had bet on had collapsed, and she needed to find another way to make the night into something she could use. Catherine thought about 29. About who she had been at 29. She had been 3 years into her marriage. She had been building the early architecture of what would become Sterling Tech's founding structure, working 16-hour days in a home office, while Harrison held client dinners and accepted credit for frameworks she had spent months designing. She had been brilliant and invisible and entirely committed to a version of her life that was worth more to everyone around her than it was to her. She had made different choices than Brittany, but she understood at some fundamental level the particular desperation of a woman trying to convert whatever she has in the moment into something that will last. "Leave her alone," Catherine said. Lucas looked at her. "Excuse me, Brittany. Whatever she's doing with the production company, whatever she told Marsh, leave it alone. Don't counter it, don't investigate it further, don't put legal pressure on it." She paused. "She has nothing that can hurt us, and going after her publicly would be—" She searched for the word small. It would be small, and we are not small. Lucas studied her for a moment, then he nodded. Understood. Margaret was looking at her with an expression that was quiet and warm and said nothing aloud. Catherine looked back. "What? Nothing," Margaret said. "I'm just watching you be exactly who I always knew you were." Catherine opened her mouth and then closed it again because there was no adequate response to that. She looked down at her hands in her lap and felt for just a moment the full weight of the evening settle over her, not crushing, not unbearable, but real. The weight of everything that had been said and done and revealed and lost and reclaimed in the last 6 hours. "Margaret," she said finally, "there's something I need to ask you." "Ask," the older woman said. 2014. When you amended the trust and put my name as the beneficiary of the property." Catherine looked at her. "Harrison and I were still married then. We had 9 more years of marriage ahead of us. Why then? How did you know?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but in the manner of someone who has been carrying an honest answer for a long time and is deciding exactly how to set it down. "I didn't know for certain," she said finally. "No one knows the future for certain. But I have been watching people for 71 years, and I have learned to see the difference between a man who is building something and a man who is consuming something." She paused. "Harrison was consuming. He was taking the things you built and spending them. He had been doing it since the beginning, but in 2014, I watched him do something specific, something at a board meeting, a decision he made that I will not detail here, and I understood that the trajectory of his choices was not going to correct itself." She looked at Catherine directly, "And I understood that you deserve to be protected from the end of that trajectory, even if you couldn't see the end yet yourself." Catherine held her gaze. "You never said anything in all those years." "What would I have said?" Margaret asked simply. "Catherine, I think your husband is going to betray you. Please sign these trust documents. You wouldn't have signed them. You were still trying, and that was right of you. You don't give up on someone before you've given them every chance." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't want to take the choice from you. I just wanted to make sure that when the end came, whatever form it took, you weren't left with nothing." The chandelier above them hummed very softly in the quiet. Catherine thought about 9 years. The 9 years after 2014. The continued building, the continued giving, the continued invisible architecture, while Harrison stood at the front of the house and accepted the credit and eventually started bringing someone else home. 9 years of not knowing that an old woman had quietly, without announcement, made sure the ground would hold. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words were completely inadequate and exactly right. Margaret reached over and patted her hand once. "Don't thank me, just do it better than he did." "That," Catherine said, "will not be difficult." Eleanor gathered her files with the practical efficiency of someone who had completed tonight's work and was already thinking about tomorrow's. She said goodnight with the warm professionalism of a woman who genuinely liked her client and showed herself out. Lucas stayed. He stayed. Not because there was more business to conduct. There wasn't. Not tonight. But because neither of them moved toward the door. And after a few minutes of Margaret gracefully excusing herself to the upstairs rooms, she kept in the east wing for nights when she stayed at the estate. There was a natural settling into the quiet of 2 people who had spent 14 months working in parallel toward a common goal, and were now for the first time in the same room without anything urgent between them. "You should get some sleep," Lucas said. Not pressingly, just noting the fact of it. "I know," Catherine said. She didn't move. "Big day tomorrow." "They're all going to be big days for a while." "Yes," he agreed. "They are." She looked at him, really looked the way she hadn't allowed herself to look during the months of careful professional boundaried collaboration. He had been during all of it exactly what she needed him to be: competent, loyal, precise, discreet. A person who understood the work and did the work without requiring acknowledgement or applause. She found she respected that more than almost anything. "How long did you know?" she asked. "About all of it, the full scope. When did Margaret bring you in on the complete picture?" 14 months ago, he said, when she first retained me. She laid out everything in the initial meeting: the trust structure, the blind trust, the forensic concerns about the executive accounts. She had already done years of her own research. I was there to verify, document, and build the legal foundation. He paused. "She also told me about you specifically, who you were, what you had built, what had been taken from you, and how." "What did you think?" Catherine asked. "When she told you?" He considered the question seriously. "I thought it was one of the most extraordinary cases of institutional invisibility I had ever encountered," he said. "A person at the absolute center of something enormous, systematically rendered peripheral by the people who benefited from her work." He looked at her steadily. "And then I looked at the documents. The original corporate structure, the founding frameworks, the strategy memos from 2009 and 2010 that were filed without a named author." He paused. "And I thought whoever built this is not a victim. They are one of the most sophisticated strategic minds I have ever seen evidence of, and they have been waiting." "I was waiting," Catherine agreed quietly. "For a long time I wasn't even sure what I was waiting for. I just knew the documents were real. I knew what I had built was real. And I knew that real things don't disappear just because someone refuses to look at them." Lucas nodded slowly. "Real things have a way of asserting themselves eventually." "They do," she said. "It just sometimes takes longer than you'd like." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Can I ask you something that isn't professionally related?" She raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you actually want?" he said. "Not the company, not the property, not the legal outcomes. What do you want for yourself, for your life, after tonight?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not intrusively, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like the first time in a very long time that someone had asked her something genuinely without any agenda beneath it, without needing the answer to serve some other purpose. She thought about it honestly. "I want to work," she said. "I want to run the company correctly and build it into what it was always supposed to be. I want to sit in meetings where I'm the person at the front of the table and not the person behind the person at the front of the table." She paused. "I want to walk through the garden in the morning and not feel like a trespasser in my own life." Another pause. "And I want—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "I want someone to know who I am," she said simply. "Not what I control, not what I'm worth on paper, not what I can do for them or their portfolio or their firm." She looked at him. "I spent 22 years with a man who never bothered to know me. I don't want to spend the next 22 years alone, but I am absolutely not willing to be known incorrectly again." She held his gaze. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Lucas said, quietly, directly. "It makes complete sense." They sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I have read every document you ever authored under the blind trust, every strategic framework, every market analysis, every handwritten notation in the margins of the founding papers." He paused. "I know who you are, Catherine. I've known for 14 months, and I've been looking forward to the moment when you didn't have to be a secret anymore." The entrance hall was very quiet. Outside, through the old walls, October wind moved through her wisteria along the south fence. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, she said, "I suppose we're starting from an interesting place." Something in his expression shifted the professional composure, loosening just enough to show what was underneath it, which was genuine and unperformed and human. "I think we are," he said. 6 months later, the world was different in ways both large and small. Sterling Tech Holdings had been formally restructured under Catherine's leadership, the new executive team announced, to quietly thunderous response from an industry that had spent years wondering why the company's most innovative periods always seemed to coincide with the initiatives that Harrison had publicly dismissed as Catherine's hobby projects. The answer, once the true corporate history became public, was both obvious and stunning. It had been covered in every major business publication. It had been the subject of a Harvard Business School case study that was developed. Catherine was informed with some amusement in record time. The property deed challenge had been resolved in 73 days, faster than Eleanor had projected, when Harrison's legal team ultimately declined to mount a substantive defense of a position the documents simply could not support. Harrison retained a small apartment in the city and a legal team that was by all accounts working very hard for a client whose position was growing less tenable by the quarter. He had not declared bankruptcy. Not yet. But the trajectory, as Lucas put it in one of his characteristic understatements, was not favorable. Brittany Vane had in fact signed a development deal with a production company. The show had not yet been greenlit, which Catherine knew because she paid attention to such things, and then made a deliberate choice not to care about them further. Brittany had also posted about 6 weeks after the gala a long statement on her social media that was clearly professionally drafted and carefully positioned, describing her experience as one of growth and self-discovery and the importance of knowing your own worth. It had received considerable engagement from her followers. Catherine had read the first paragraph and then closed the browser. Margaret Sterling had moved more formally into the east wing of the estate, which felt right and true, and exactly as it should be, the woman who had protected the house returning to live in it properly for however many years she chose. She and Catherine had breakfast together on Tuesday mornings. It had started the week after the gala tentatively and had solidified into something that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that neither of them would consider breaking. They sat in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, the kitchen with coffee and whatever the cook had left out, and they talked, really talked. About the company and about the legal proceedings, and about Margaret's memories of the house when she was young, and about Catherine's childhood, and about the strange, winding, costly path that had brought them both to this table on Tuesday mornings. Catherine looked forward to Tuesdays more than she looked forward to most things. On a Tuesday in late March, 6 months after the gala, Catherine was in the library when Lucas arrived. He had taken to working from the estate on the days when they had joint meetings. There were still several ongoing legal matters that required their combined attention, and he moved through the house with the ease of someone who had stopped being a guest and become something that didn't have a clean category name yet. She was at her desk when he came in, reading a brief that Eleanor's team had sent over regarding the final asset reconciliation. He put a coffee on the edge of her desk without being asked because he had figured out her coffee preferences in approximately their 3rd week of working together and had never made her ask since. She looked up from the brief. "Harrison's team filed the supplemental motion," she said. "I saw it," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "It's thin. They're arguing the 2009 founding documents were signed under conditions that constitute material misrepresentation. It won't hold." "No," he agreed. "It won't. Eleanor gives it 2 weeks before dismissal." Catherine set the brief down. She looked at Lucas across the desk, across the coffee he had brought without being asked, across the 14 months of documents and the 6 months of mornings, and the slow, unannounced, completely natural way that two people who had started as collaborators had become something that felt increasingly like a life being built in the same direction. "Lucas," she said. When this is finished, when the last motion is dismissed and the last filing is resolved and there's nothing left of the legal proceedings, what are you going to do?" He looked at her steadily. "I was planning to stay," he said simply. She held his gaze. "Good," she said, "because I need someone who reads briefs correctly and makes decent coffee, and those two skills are genuinely difficult to find in combination." He smiled a real smile, the kind that reached all the way through, and she smiled back, and outside through the library's floor-to-ceiling windows, her wisteria was beginning to bloom along the south fence in the early spring light, purple and persistent, and exactly where she had planted it all those years ago, when she had still believed that things you built with your own hands had a way of lasting. She had been right about that. She had been right about more than anyone had given her credit for. That was no longer anyone's secret. The woman who had built an empire from the quiet, who had held the foundation while others stood on it and called it theirs, who had waited with the patience of someone who understood that real things do not disappear simply because someone refuses to see them. That woman was no longer invisible. She was exactly, completely, and permanently herself. And that was something no one would ever take from her again.